Now, when I was in high school, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, perfect. When I was in high school, I was pretty well put together, or at least I thought I was pretty well put together for a high school student at the time. I was popular, I was tall, I got good grades, I was a star athlete. In fact, most of you probably can't picture a high school Christian about how this kind of slightly pudgy, bearded man ended up that way. But let me show you a picture of 18-year-old Christian. There we go. If you can't see at home, I look like Sunshine from Remember the Titans if he lived a harder life. This is 18-year-old Christian, and I, at the time, thought that I was king of the world. That was until Kevin showed up. Now, when my junior year of high school, I started hearing rumors about this guy coming to class that I hadn't met yet. Apparently, he was handsome, he was chivalrous, he was polite, he loved Jesus, which we went to a Christian school, so, that was kind of like a status marker in some ways. And I remember, I didn't know his name, and I asked this friend of mine what his name was, and she looked at me, and she got this dreamy look in her eyes, and she said, his name's Kevin. Sexy Kevin. And I knew in that moment that I hated him. And so, when very quickly he became my fierce rival and I became his, we battled for different things. And while we didn't do it outwardly, inwardly, we celebrated our victories over one another. For instance, he came off the bench in soccer and I was a starter and the captain of the basketball team. Point Christian. Now, on the other hand, though, he was the student body president, and I was demoted to the lowly student body chaplain. Now, on the other side, though, I became the homecoming king, and he was the first prince, which was a really sweet victory in a lot of ways. But then, on the other side, he was the one that had the six-pack and the girls were swooning over, and I looked like High School Musical Zac Efron, which, granted, was working for me at the time. And it all came to a head. I remember it was a small moment. It came to a head where I remember he broke curfew and he got grounded. And I remember when I heard the news that inwardly I celebrated. But then I remember right after celebrating, feeling like this turmoil of emotions and really hating that feeling of hate that I felt in my heart. See, the problem is we live in a world that's divided. We don't have to look very far to see the division in our world. In fact, just look at our sports teams. We love rivalries and looking at how they battle out in the world. Think of just like the Lakers and the Celtics, or the Red Sox and the Yankees. And we think of these often as kind of these lighthearted rivalries that really don't do any real damage. We think of them as, maybe the worst thing that can happen to you is if your team loses, then it's a disappointment, but you go on with your life. But in reality, we live in a world that is far more divided in a darker way. We live in a world that's polarized politically, ethnically, societally, and even interpersonally. And the time of Jesus was certainly no different than ours. See, his world was filled with a plethora of divides. There were ethnic tensions between the Jews and the Gentiles. There was political tension between the Roman Empire and the Jewish leaders. There was economic and societal tension between the wealthy of the city and the lowly subsistence farmers. See, it sounds strangely like our world today. Our world is highlighted by the exact same tensions: ethnic, political, societal, and economic. And just like us, they had enemies and rivals as well. And just like us, their way of response was rejection and isolation and dispute when it came to those who were different. They looked to conquer their enemies and to triumph. Yet Jesus calls his disciples to something radically different. He exhorts them not just to skirt the tension, to give in to the divides, but to reorient their lives into following Jesus. And so this morning, we're going to take a look at the way of Jesus and how it changes how we treat our enemies or the outsider. And in doing so, we're just going to ask 3 questions and answer the 3 questions. and see how Jesus exhorts his disciples to live. So if you have your Bibles, open to Luke chapter 6. It'll also be on the screen here as well. And one note before we start, we have a ton of ground to cover this morning. We are going to fly through this text. And so I would encourage you to spend time sitting with it and meditating on it during the week. But as we step into the teaching of Jesus, we first have to remember the setting so far. So far, Jesus is sitting on the side of a mountain teaching. And we don't know exactly where it is. It's probably in northern Israel somewhere nearish to the coast. But we do know the type of people that would have been there. In fact, it actually tells us at the beginning of chapter 6 that people from all around Israel and even beyond the borders of Israel are coming to hear Jesus preach. There would have been the farmers from the countryside, the fishermen from the nearby shore. There would have been the wealthy elite from the cities there to hear Jesus, and even the Pharisees and scribes are there, even if it's just a hate watch what Jesus is doing. See, as Jesus stands up to preach, he preaches to this diverse crowd, and as he does so, he says something very radical. He speaks to the whole crowd, and he said, "Blessed are the lowly, and cursed are those who take advantage of their neighbor." He flips the societal structure on its head. And he's speaking to a large group of people, but right after this, Jesus pauses and he begins to speak to his disciples, causing them to consider what it really means to follow them. See, the first question is this: what does it mean to follow Jesus? This is how the passage starts off. "But I say to you that listen." Now, this seems like a small phrase. It doesn't seem like it matters that much, but it's actually critical to the rest of this teaching by Jesus. Jesus starts off by saying, "But I say to you that listen." The first thing that he's actually doing with this is moving and reorienting his audience, moving from speaking generally to the crowd at large to speaking to those who say that they listen to him, actually his disciples, those who care to hear what he has to say. Beyond that, though, it actually also functions as a call to action. The phrase is close to the one that says, "He who has ears, let him hear," which isn't just a weird anatomy statement. It's actually addressing an idea that those who are actually hearing the words spoken will also follow them. It implies taking the words seriously in a way that doesn't merely shape internal focus, but external practice. See, Jesus, throughout his entire exhortation, will continually call his followers to act. Right after this, he actually will say, give examples of what it means to concretely love others. Later on, he's actually going to use the word "to do" over 5 times in the passage. And then at the end of the passage, he'll say that those who actually are following Jesus both hear and do. See, "But I say to you that listen." He's calling people to act. See, Jesus is quick to highlight and will continue to highlight throughout this exhortation that following him requires obedience. And while we may agree with this in our words, so far too often we don't actually obey Jesus. See, what's the question? What does it mean to follow Jesus? The answer is the way of Jesus requires obedience. And this is incredibly important because we often treat the teachings of Jesus like an intellectual exercise. Like somehow we hyper-spiritualize it, like thinking of it as a way to morally exhort ourselves, like we'll do something different in our hearts. But actually the way of Jesus calls us to a way of obedience, and a radical obedience is that. It calls us to obey his actual commands. See, true listening requires obedience. If we take seriously Jesus, if we honor him and his ways, we must have ears to hear. Think of it this way. My mom's here this morning, and it's good that I showed you a picture because you're going to hear a lot about teenage Christian and what a punk I was today. But I like to get out of things. I like to figure out a way to pass off work to my siblings or to try to figure out how to not do the job that I was asked. And if my mom asked me, "Hey, I want you to clean your room," and I came back to her and I said, "Hey, I memorized what you said. You said clean your room." She'd be like, "No, I want you to actually clean your room, not memorize what I have to say." Or if I came back later and I said, "Hey, I learned in the original Greek what it means when you say clean your room." Or if I came back later and I said, hey, I got a group of my friends together, and we all studied and talked about what it would look like if we actually cleaned my room. No, my mom wants me to actually clean my room. In the same way, we would never take a response like that from our parents or from others when they ask us to do something, but far too often we hear the words of Jesus and we treat them like an intellectual exercise, instead of actually realizing that Jesus is calling us to obedience. It's not just a nice suggestion, but Jesus is calling us to hear and to do. The way of Jesus is not just an intellectual exercise, but one that requires obedience. Yet, what Jesus calls us to is way more difficult than most of us realize. And most of us are willing to engage in as well. See, the second question is, who are our enemies? And maybe more importantly, how do we treat them? This is what it goes on to say in the passage. But I say to you that listen, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even the sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. See, Jesus directly calls his disciples to love their enemies. Now, the concept of an enemy is an interesting one. It could have been a couple of different things. One, it was certainly that of the Roman and the Jewish leaders. They were frustrated with one another, the empire because they wouldn't obey, and the people because the empire isolated them and conquered them. But at the same time, the world in the ancient world was built on a couple of different types of relationships. Kinship and patron-client relationships. Now, kinship was simply this, that you loved the people who were in your community. You took care of those who were part of your family. But on the flip side, there was also patron-client relationships where somebody who had a good or a service or could do something for you had means. They were the patrons, and they would bless the clients, those who needed something from them, those who needed them to survive. See, in this concept, the enemy was just merely also the outsider. It was certainly your enemy, the rival, the people that you hated because of the way that they treated you, but it was also just merely those who were outside of you, those who were different. In fact, that word implies outsider as well. It's a hard word to translate. Yet Jesus calls them to love the enemy and the outsider in an active manner without expecting return. And again, as he calls them to love their enemy, it's not just merely an intellectual exercise. Like he highlighted with his opening words, this requires action. He actually gives 4 specific ways to love your enemies. He says love, which is actually an active love, a love of doing. Do good, bless, pray. And then he actually gives examples of what this active love would look like. He says if your enemy strikes you, turn the other cheek. This actually connotes physical violence, but it also is a way of insult. In fact, the way that people were rejected from the synagogue when they were tossed out on the street is they were often backhanded across the face. But he's saying, instead of responding to the insult, love your enemy. He tells them to give radically. He says, if somebody asks for your coat, give them your entire outfit, which is crazy in a time that they probably only had one outfit. Beyond that, he says, give to the beggar if they ask. These words, give here, implies ongoing habitual giving. It's this idea that love here is habitual and action-oriented. And Jesus actually points this out. As he continues on, he says, that love is unselfish and hopeful that enemies will change, but not resentful if they don't. It's self-giving love. It's love that requires sacrifice. And in the middle of the exhortation, he gives this incredibly stunning statement. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule. Now, what's interesting here is actually the inverse of this phrase was common at the time. Do not do to others what you would not like done to yourself. And in fact, this appears in tons of ancient literature, so much that we couldn't even go through it. It would take a long time for us to look at all the different places that mentions the inverse. But here, Jesus actually calls them to do the opposite. Actively do to others what you would want them to do to you. Treat people like you want to be treated. See, he points out that sinners do it the other way. They do things and expect return. But the way of Jesus requires self-giving love of our enemies, expecting reward only from God. See, this way of thinking that Jesus calls us to actively love our enemies flips our conceptions of the world upside down. How do we treat our enemies? Well, the way of Jesus calls us to actively love our enemies. What's interesting is that this isn't the rhetoric of how we treat our enemies. We desire to crush them, to lord over them. We want our careers to advance, to have good families, to live more fulfilling lives, even if it comes at the sake of others. And while we may not say these things out loud, we know the inner fantasies of defeating them and the defeats of watching them succeed. Last night, Jocelyn and I were watching a documentary. And during this documentary, they interview this woman who blames this man for killing her son. And as she's talking, she talks about when the man passed away. And she said, I bought the best bottle of wine I could find, and I toasted to his death. It's a dark moment in the documentary, but Jocelyn leaned over to me in a moment of honesty and said, I can relate to that. And if we're being honest, we can all relate to that because we enjoy when our enemies pass away. Or at least even just pass away societally. We like to defeat those around us. Yet here Jesus forces us to consider who our enemies are and how we treat them. He expands our thinking beyond those we just actively disagree with or dislike, but rather to those that are just simply outside of us. This is Jesus speaking of someone who's across the political aisle from you, of the immigrant, the orphan, and the homeless person that you will inevitably pass by on your way home today. This is Jesus speaking of the rival, the person that slighted you, or the person that you just simply ignore. And this is Jesus speaking of the person that doesn't look like you, act like you, or vote like you. See, Jesus is calling us to know who they are, but not just know who they are, but treat them as we ourselves would want to be treated. He calls us to actively and sacrificially love them, rather than to seek their demise or apathetically pass them by. And this is a problem in our tribalistic world, because we set boundaries of who belongs and who doesn't, politically, socially, ethnically, and economically. In fact, cultural critic David Brooks, in his book, The Second Mountain, addresses this very idea. And he talks about how this is caused by a radical individualism and self-centeredness. And he points this out. He says that in our reaction to individualism, to ourselves being the prize above all else, we revert to tribalism, finding those who affirm our feelings and beliefs. And he says this is the dark side of community because it's built around isolating somebody else that looks different or acts differently than you. Instead, he says true community is that built on affection, when self-forgetfulness is our basis, when humility is the way that we engage with others, and kindness, then we can truly love our neighbor. It requires us to look outside of ourselves and examine the world around us. See, to love our enemies, we first have to take a look at the depths of our own hearts. Far too often, we look for our enemies in the shadows, but we don't pause to actually look at who's casting the shadow. And when we do that, we realize that the problem may be us. See, the way of love is radically different. The way of love forces us to put down our hurts and pains and orient ourselves in Christ. It leads us to love our enemies and the outsider in a way that forgets everything, that leaves it behind and shares actively in forgiveness and in love, demonstrating God's work to the world. When I was a teenager, I remember learning this lesson for the first time. My dad and I had driven down to Roswell to visit family, and we were driving back from Roswell, and we were near Klein's Corners, and there was somebody by the side of the road that had a sign saying, ran out of gas. It was kind of by a derelict car. They looked pretty rough around the edges, said anything helps. My dad pulled over on the side of the freeway and got out of his car, walked up to the guy and gave him $20, and then walked back to the car and sat down. And to be honest with you, I was indignant. I said, Dad, you know what that guy's going to do with that money? Like, why would you give that person that money? Like, you don't know anything. Is that actually going to help them? And I kind of start chewing my dad out. And my dad looks at me and he says, yeah, but Christian, that's not what Jesus calls us to. Jesus calls us to give. That's what Jesus calls us to do, is to love the enemy and the outsider. Not to judge, not to condemn, but to put those things down and to love. Are you willing to love your enemy sacrificially? To see the people around you, to stop, listen, and to take care of the people as you pass them by, to give freely and generously. See, Jesus calls us to actively love our enemies, the outsider among us. But Jesus also realizes one other thing here, that if our life is not rooted in Him, if it's not built actively upon a firm foundation, then the facade of love will come crashing down. This is why He finally asks, what have you built your life on? This is how He closes the exhortation. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For the measure you give will be the measure you get back. He also told them a parable. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully qualified will be like the teacher. Why do you see the speck in your neighbor's eye, but do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your neighbor, friend, let me take out the speck in your eye, when you yourselves do not see the log in your own eye? You hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your neighbor's eye. No good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. Figs are not gathered from thorns, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. The good person out of good treasure of the heart produces good, and the evil person out of the evil treasure produces evil. For it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do what I tell you? I will show you that someone is like me, who comes to me, hears my word, and acts on them. That one is like a man building a house, who dug deeply and laid a foundation on a rock. And when the flood arose, the river burst against the house, but could not shake it, because it had been well built. But the one who hears and does not act is like a man who built a house on the ground without a foundation. When the river burst against it, immediately it fell, and great was the ruin of that house. While Jesus recognizes the importance of habitually engaging in acts of love, He also realizes that it's impossible apart from true foundation. He does so by highlighting the folly of our hearts in 4 examples. The first, He actually calls the disciples not to judge and condemn others, but rather to forgive and give, relying on God for their reward, comparing it to a fair scoop at a market. Second, He warns those that don't heed the words of God that they'll be like the blind leading the blind right into calamity. Third, He calls them to self-examination. This is interesting because He seems to recognize the tendency of the human heart that as they're hearing these things about loving their enemies, about caring for others, that they're probably thinking about other people in the crowd that need to obey these rules. Oh, if only that person would do that, the world would be a better place. But here, Jesus isn't letting them escape their self-examination. He's calling them to see their own problems. He says, we're so quick to recognize the floater in someone else's eye that we don't see the log that's sticking out of our own. And this is actually really funny and humorous in many ways, because the word that Jesus uses for log is actually the word that would be the foundation of a house. The foundational beam of a house is what's sticking out of our own eye, and we can't see it, but we can see the floater in our enemy's eye. See, Jesus is calling us to hear and to reflect on ourselves. Fourth, Jesus points out that our lives reveal our roots. He points out that the fruit that is produced in our lives is indicative of health of the roots. My family are pecan farmers. I've talked about this before. I love going down there and walking around the old orchard. There's a newer orchard, and then there's the old orchard. And the old orchard is filled with these gigantic, huge trees. And as you walk around the old orchard, it's great to walk around. You pick up pecans. You can crack them. You can eat them as you're walking and just kind of meditating in the quiet. But every once in a while, when you're walking through, you'll stumble across, you'll start cracking nuts, and you'll realize that they're bad, that they're shriveled up. And you'll look at the tree, and the tree looks big and strong on the outside. But as you start looking at the pecans, they're shriveled and bitter. Even though it looks big and beautiful, the tree reveals its actual health of its roots and its fruit. And see, far too often, this is our case as well. Our roots actually reveal how we live. Our roots are actually revealed in how you live. Jesus closes his teaching with one more haunting illustration of that of a foundation, causing the listeners to examine what they've built their life upon. He says, if you've built a strong foundation, when the storm comes, your house will be fine. But if you've built a weak one, your house will get swept away. Depending on the foundation of the house, it tells us if we'll make it through the storm or not. See, inevitably, calamity comes in life. It will find us. But our foundations speak to our resilience. Jesus wants us to recognize that it matters what we've built our life upon. See, the way of Jesus needs a firm foundation. All of us build our lives on something. Maybe it's career or family, political identities, justice, or even some silly group identity like a band or a sports team or a hobby. And maybe a few of us have built our lives on Jesus. And I speak that of myself as well. Because whatever it is, we all build our lives on something. Just ask somebody what their identity is and they'll probably reveal it. But the question isn't what have we built our lives on or what has the other person in the room built their life on. It's what have you built your life on. See, it's important to note that this call is for you, not for others in the room or those who are online. Even as I'm running through these examples, I'm guessing that some of our minds are wandering to people that we can think of that fit in some of those categories, not even recognizing the ways that we fit into those categories. But Jesus refuses to let us escape these questions. He challenges us to examine the true reality of how we're living our lives and what we're rooted in. See, Jesus seems concerned that this action, this obedience to him, is a result of the foundation of our lives. We can look big and powerful on the outside, but our fruit can be rotten, revealing our unhealthy roots. Instead, Jesus calls us to be rooted in him, firmly planted, and in doing so, our life will be marked by the good fruit of love, and when the storms come, we will not be shaken. In following Jesus, we have to realize what our life's been based on. When we have based our lives on the right things, it leads us not only to be able to weather the calamities that come, but also to love our enemies. I was reminded of this when I was thinking about John Lewis this week. John Lewis recently passed away. He was a congressman, but also a civil rights icon. He was one of the original 6 of Selma. He led the first march across the bridge, actually into an onslaught of police brutality. But one of the things that most people don't know about John Lewis is that he was actually an ordained Baptist minister. Lewis in 1961 was sitting in a whites-only area in South Carolina, and he was beaten within an inch of his life with his companion. Years later, he was sitting down somewhere, and an older man walked up to him in his 70s who was accompanied by his son, and he said, "Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people who beat you and your seatmate. And I'd been a member of the Klan, and I want to apologize. Will you accept my apology, and will you forgive me?" The story goes that tearfully John Lewis forgave him. And he went on to say, it's the power of the way of peace, the way of love. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, hate is too heavy of a burden to bear. You must never hate. The way of love is a better way. The way of peace is a better way. See, John Lewis built his life on something more than hate, which he certainly deserved because of the ways that people treated him. Yet he was able to love in a radical way, and when he faced violence, he was able to weather the storm. See, the question for us is, what have we built our life on? Jesus requires obedience. He calls us to actively love our enemies and to build our lives on a firm foundation rooted in Him. And all of this may seem incredibly overwhelming to you. And fair enough. It is a totally overwhelming thing to think about. Building your life on something more, loving your enemy, and obeying Jesus are all heavy burdens on their own. And frankly, they're just impossible on our own. And beyond that, it can feel problematic, like somehow in doing these things, you're earning your way to God. If this is it, then it becomes an issue. But that's why we need Jesus' words of comfort right in the middle of the passage. Look back at verse 30. Look back at verse 35. But love your enemies, do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. Your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. It says that God will give abundant blessing to those who hear and do, who build their life on Him. But notice here who's welcome to partake, for He is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. See, we forget that we are only able to do any of this because of the God who first loved us. See, we have been the ungrateful and the wicked. We have not loved our neighbor. We have left things, we have both done and left undone injustices in the world. Yet the grace of God is for us too. See, when you were the enemy, when you were the outsider, when you were sitting on the other side of the political aisle, Jesus came for you. Jesus came to rescue those who were near to Him and those who were far off. By His mercy, when we wanted nothing to do with Him, He came for you. See, when we put people in the shadows, in the shade, there is no shade in the shadow of the cross. See, God's grace is for all, regardless of their classification. And this is why the church in the New Testament would be marked by radical forgiveness and love of enemy. This is what led Stephen, as he was being stoned to death, to forgive his enemies. What led Paul in Romans to exhort the church to do good to those that did evil to them. For Peter, in 1 Peter, to tell people, bless those who do evil to you and curse you. And for Jesus, in His final moments on the cross, to forgive those who crucified them. Not just forgive them in the moment, but also to provide forgiveness for their sins. That this radical forgiveness that Jesus extended is extended to us. In it, it changes our identity and operation in the world. And I know that I keep saying the word radically, but I don't know quite else how to put it, if I'm being honest. Because it flips everything on its head. Jesus changes our ethical reality, not by just telling us what to do, but by doing it Himself. While we were still sinners, Christ died for the ungodly. It's only because of this that we can love our enemies, be reconciled to those who hate us, and those who we hate. Many years later, 7 years ago, my wife and I moved back from Denver. And we were church hopping. We were trying to figure out where we were going. And we ended up at North Church here in town. It used to be Mars Hill. And we walked in that morning, walked past the greeters. We got our coffee. And we walked to the sanctuary. And who was there to greet me but Kevin? Now, Kevin starts to talk to me. And I thought in that moment I had gotten past all those things. I had started to go bald. I had gotten bigger. I rooted myself in a different identity, or so I thought. But as I saw him walking in, I remember all of those old feelings start to bubble right back up. I hadn't thought about Kevin in years. But Kevin and I start talking. Kevin invites me to his community group. And Kevin and I start to hang out a little bit in our community group. I knew some of the other people there. We start to kind of eat dinner with each other, around each other. And months later, Kevin and I are sitting at a table. We're talking about something that's going on in our life. And almost simultaneously, over our plates of food, we lean in and said, "Man, I hated you in high school." But Jesus had done something. The way of Jesus, the love of neighbor, the love of enemy, the way that Jesus demonstrated that to us had changed both Kevin and I. Over the last 7 years, Kevin has become one of my closest friends. In fact, we talk weekly. We talk about what God is doing in our life as fathers, as friends. We get together frequently and often, and hopefully maybe even tonight. And I'm not saying that this is true for everybody's enemy or outsider, that somehow you'll become best friends. But the way of Jesus radically changes how we engage the enemy and the outsider. And so the question then for us is this: what will you build your life on? Will you obey Jesus? Will you love your enemy? Will you embrace the love of God who first loved you even when you were his enemy? Let's pray. Jesus, thank you. Thank you that you first loved us. That, Lord, while we were far off, you came and you died for us. That while we were your enemies, that you loved us. Lord, I pray that as we reflect on that reality, God, that you would change not just our intellect, but change how we do. Would you change not just our head and our heart, but would you change our hands? Jesus, thank you. Thank you that we can gather and hear your word together today. And Lord, I pray as we enter into this time of response that you'll speak to us, that your Holy Spirit will move in and through us. It's in your name we pray. Amen.